Well, welcome everyone, and thanks for coming. Can I just ask if you're all PhD students or any undergrads here or MAs? MAs, okay. But everyone else is a PhD student. Okay, brilliant. Thank you. So I'll just wait for Tyler to take a lot of pizza. Okay, well, I'm going to start our session. My name is Jo McDonagh, and I'm the current director of the Nicholson Center for British Studies. And the Nicholson Center, if you don't know, is our mission is to support British studies in the university. So for a long time now, we have interpreted British studies to include the study of Britain's empire and the legacies of that empire as well. So it's actually a very broad remit that we have. And one of the principal ways in which we support British studies is by supporting student research in the UK and Ireland. So we wanted to take an opportunity to give you some information about the ways in which we do this, the fellowships that we give. So basically fellowships or mainly fellowships to support travel to do research in Britain and Ireland. And I've invited to the session to speak to you alongside me are two colleagues from the faculty board, Professor Ulrika Stern and Julie Orlimansky. Ulrika's from South Asian Studies and Julie is from English, and Julie is also the DGS in English, so has a lot of detailed specialised information and points of view from that point of view. And then I've invited also three former fellows, graduate fellows of the centre, who have all had a Nicholson fellowships, because they're probably the best people to tell you about the process of applying and what it's like doing the research in Britain. So I have on my right Hope Clancy, who's in political politics.
Dancy, sorry.
Dancy, yes. I'm so sorry. Oops. And then Kashaf Qureshi, who's a medieval English literature person, and Senior Podboyskaya. How did I do with that? Was that
pretty good? And it's actually, I say Ksenia.
Ksenia.
Okay. Ksenia is probably more accurate.
Okay.
The way I say it, it might like anglicized version.
And Ksenia is in the history department. So we also have in the room with us Jean Fitzsimmons, who's the Associate Director of the Nicholson Center, who's got lots of experience of advising students on making the applications. We've also got, so she's here for a font of information, so she can help out as well. We've got on the screen our new, just hot off the press website, still partly under construction. We're still putting material on it, but we're quite pleased with it. We think it looks nice. But I put this on the screen because to show you where information about the fellowships is. So it's on under research and fellowships and prizes. And there we develop the fellowships and prizes into graduate research opportunities and undergraduate research opportunities, and then prizes as well. But we won't really be thinking about that. But for master's students, well, I can talk about that separately, but because it's slightly different there. But given that you're all postgraduates, for PhD candidates, I'll just call up that page so that we can look at that and show you what the application process looks like. So it's now on an online system. But what I wanted to do in the session is divide our time into three And in the first section of our discussion time, I want to invite our former fellows to say a few words about the experience that they've had when they were doing research in UK and or Britain or Ireland. I think they all went to the UK, actually. I think you all went to London, in fact. Actually, maybe you didn't. You went somewhere.
No, I went to London.
It was also London as well. Okay. So anyway, so I'm going to ask them to talk about that. And I'm going to ask them how the work that they did in the archives has really impacted on and helped shape the projects that they're working on, and also for advice really about things that they'd kind of advise you to think about, things that they wish that they'd thought about when they were making, before they went, and that became obvious when they were there. Then the second section of our session, I'd like to invite the faculty here to talk about what makes a good application. So we think that would be a helpful thing for you as you're kind of preparing to apply for fellowships. And then I would like to save time for questions, but actually it would be great if you have questions as we go along to just put up your hands, and we can, it'd be good to involve you as much as possible. I think you get more out of a session if you're involved in it than just listeners. So I'm going to kick off by asking Hope to say a few words about your project and what going to the London archives meant for you.
Yeah, okay, thank you. My name's Hope Dancy. I'm a fourth year PhD candidate in political science, and I work on colonial agreements. Part of that project for my dissertation is actually building a data set of agreements. So somewhat different than your usual historical research that you do in the archives. And basically I went over to look at agreements that the British signed with various non-European colonies. Those are largely the easiest way to access them is to just go to the Colonial Office records in the archives. And so I spent most of my time in Kew, in the British archives, a little bit in the British Library for some of their India collection. And now, after taking pictures of so many treaties and scanning so many treaties, I'm working on building a data set of all of the treaties I look through. And it's been an invaluable experience, not just because I got the treaties, but there are things that I would not have picked up if I did not sit in front of the treaties. So very interestingly, the British bureaucratize their colonial project, and they actually send typed out template, fill in the blank treaties that you wouldn't see if it was typed up. That these are literally like templates that they send out. So that's just one aspect of how the trip was just absolutely invaluable for me.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I understand that was one of the most common forms of colonial publishing, actually, was publishing blank forms. So it's interesting you say that. I just read that yesterday. It's really fascinating. Anyway, Kaushal.
Yeah, so I mainly went to the British Library as well as the Lambeth Palace Library, which is also in London. My project, so when I applied, I was actually in my second year, so I didn't have like a dissertation project. And I was more so going, on the one hand, for a more exploratory kind of trip where I wanted to just look at medieval manuscripts in one of the places that has the most medieval manuscripts ever. And more specifically, my project had to do with Middle English miracle stories. They're a pretty, I think, understudied genre within the field. And so I was interested in looking at those collections, seeing how they're formatted, seeing what miracle stories are grouped with, because medieval manuscripts are usually, sometimes they're like 100 pages with like 10 different genres and 10 different texts inside of them. So I wanted to take a look at that. I wanted to see what exactly these miracle stories were, because so many of them aren't transcribed. Or if they are transcribed, they're in like very obscure, out of print 19th or 18th century, like German editions. So part of my project had to do with, it was kind of like a uncovering / recovering project. And I was specifically interested in looking at moments of transgression in these miracle stories. There's a lot of like violence in them. And so I wanted to look at what those moments of violence were doing and how they became articulated into this like miraculous, well, I guess just to pretty straightforward, what happens in most of these stories is there's some like transgressive act, and then the Virgin Mary appears and like forgives the transgressor. And so I was interested in like seeing how these narratives were even stitched together, what kind of depth there was in them. And the only way to do that was to actually go there and just look through these like dozens of manuscripts that contain these stories, because it's so hard to find them in print. So yeah, that was the gist of my project. And I got a lot out of kind of going there with a more exploratory lens and like letting myself pull not just like miracle story collections, but also like lyrics and medical treatises. And I got like a really good sense of how diverse and how variant the manuscripts in my field are, which is, I think, has like set me up in a pretty good position to think about what the next steps would be when I am writing my dissertation prospectus, and want to like figure out what each chapter is going to be and like where I need to go to find certain archives and do that kind of research. It was really helpful figuring that out.
It sounds completely fascinating. And were you surprised by the manuscripts when you actually saw them?
I think so. I was surprised. One thing I was surprised by was just because you can almost read the handwriting in one doesn't mean you can read the handwriting in the next, because the handwriting changed, like just in the, you know, from the same like decade, I would be looking at two manuscripts from two different regions, and handwriting in one was like, I could, you know, I got the gist of it, and then the other was just completely illegible. And so it was really surprising to see how different handwriting is, especially when you're working with like these modernized, standardized in print editions most of the time. So that was really helpful and good to keep in mind, that if I did want to do this kind of research going forward, I'd probably need to take some more paleography courses.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. Cassania, over to you.
I just wanted to say on the paleography, I do 19th century British imperial history. My sister is a teacher and did a medieval history master's, and she always laughs at me when I complain about handwriting, because she's like, first of all, don't see my students' handwriting, and second of all, wait till you have to learn like the paleography of each individual monastery. But also like 19th century officials who have to write letters without the use of their secretaries. Very poor at handwriting. So yeah, I'm Ksenia. I'm a third year history PhD student, and I did my Nicholson trip right after my first year. So I went, not really knowing what my dissertation was going to be about. I went to do research for the second year history paper that we're required to write. And I did it right after a year of doing online Zoom PhD studies. So for me, it was kind of amazing because as a historian, you know, people are always telling you about how your job is about being in the archive, and that's where all of the magic happens. And then I went through a year that was like very demoralizing. I'm like, okay, like what is this profession? And then you get to go to the archive and actually see what all the fuss is about, I guess. So similarly, I had a kind of exploratory approach, except that what I would say, and it's kind of a boring piece of advice, but the application process itself was one of the most helpful things, because I don't want to speak for what gets approved, but what the advice I was given was the more specific you can be about what it is that you want to look at, and the more detailed you can be about that, the better, which made me have this like vast plan of like, in an ideal world, here's all of the things that I would look at. And I went to the British Library, I went to the National Archives, and I went to the UCL archives as well. And it was, it was really generative. And similarly to Hope, I had the experience of like, you can think you know what you're looking for, but then once you get there, you're seeing it, you're noticing all of these other things, or you might be able to pull new material that you didn't know about, or didn't think were really in there. And also going with funding, like the like unspoken thing about like what this does for you is it just allows you to go and do research without being constantly stressed about paying for that research. And you just have a much more enjoyable time when you can afford to be there a little bit longer, and you can afford to take your time enjoying looking at the documents, and you're not constantly like, how am I going to afford to live in London? Because London is a very, very expensive city. Yeah, so really now my research is still sort of based on the documents that I found on that first research trip, and I've been back last summer as well, and I'm going back again for a much longer trip this year. There's still hundreds of photographed pages of documents from that trip that I have not gone through. So it's, you know, I would, as a piece of advice, I would also like try to figure out what your goals are going to be while you're there, because it's really easy to get like carried away like a child in a candy store and then just start like photographing everything instead of actually reading it, because there's so much to look at. But yeah, that's great.
And anyone got any questions yet? Things that you'd like to ask? Things if you've been thinking about your own projects and the things that you might be applying for.
I do want to add something to what Ksenia just said, because I have actually, before I was a Nicholson Fellow, I did like a shorter exploratory trip through another grant that had a very different process. And I just love that part of the Nicholson application process is you're really generating like a plan and a list much more than I think other funding. And so it might seem like a big project to get the application done at the time, but then like the hardest part almost is done by the time you send in the application, which is like once you get the funding, you can go and just literally pull from your list of stuff that you said you wanted to look at. And it's actually incredibly helpful for staying on track.
Yeah. Also, like so much of applying for grants, like can feel like, oh, this is like your second job as a grad student. It's just like a grant writer. And so what's nice about the Nicholson is like, know that the process of doing the application is actually some work that you would want to be doing anyway, given that you will likely go on that research trip one way or another. And you will have to do that, and you don't want to be doing it last minute, also because some archives are really difficult to work with, and you want to know ahead of time what you want to look at so that you can email them like a month in advance or whatever.
Where did you stay?
I stayed in an Airbnb, and I rented like a room rather than a full apartment. But actually, the funny story about the Airbnb is it's like a really lovely Austrian and German couple in London that like has all these young children, and they live in this house, and I rented a room in this house. And since then, like 3 other people that I know have stayed with them, and I'm going back for like a 3rd trip. So, yeah, I just booked a room, but it's hard. It is hard to find.
It's a lot of Airbnb digging. I actually found there was a university that puts their dorms up on Airbnb in the summer.
Which university was that?
It was actually the Courtauld Institute, the like art institute. And downside to that though is like you don't have your own kitchen, and so if you get COVID, like I did, you're trapped in like a little room for a long time. But other than that, I really liked it.
Yeah, UCL also has dorms.
So I stayed in the University College London dorms. They have like a ton of different like spots all around the city that you can stay in, and it's like it is just a standard dorm. And then after that, I actually coordinated my trip with another Nicholson Center fellow, Mary Kemp Thornberry, and so after that our like schedules lined up, and so we got to like split like hotels and Airbnbs and whatever was cheapest.
How long were you?
Mine was it was between 3 and 4 weeks.
Mine was 4 weeks.
Mine was 6.
I guess, would you recommend, if you have kind of research ideas that could use the help of British archives, would you recommend doing it in the first few years or sort of waiting, because presumably the same thing, you would need the same kind of archives during your dissertation process.
I think, which year were you in when you went?
So I just did the summer between 3rd and 4th year. Okay. So I went with I hadn't defended my prospectus yet, right. But it was in pursuit of writing the prospectus, and I had already done a little bit of exploratory research beforehand. So I'm kind of different from the other two fellows in that I was, I think, a little bit more focused.
Polly, do you have a view on this?
Yeah, I have. So I'm from the Department of South Asian Languages and Civilizations, and we have lots of students who are working on various aspects of British imperial history, colonialism, or print culture projects that involve technologies that travel from Europe to South Asia. So I'm going to speak largely to those of you who work on, aspects of the colonial archive. And a number of very interesting questions already came up. So one is the question of when to go. I think for any of those who have a British Empire or colonial history project in the wider sense, and you have to work with the colonial archive, you have to do some advanced planning because you will probably and highly likely have to go more than once. So I highly recommend doing an exploratory trip very early on. When you have a sense of what kind of archive you're going to look at. I'll come to the kind of precision and specification you have to put into the application later. But a shorter exploratory trip followed by a more targeted longer trip typically works out best. And the other thing I wanted to mention is that, especially if you work with colonial records, if you go to the British Library or if you go to Kew for the first time, it is absolutely overwhelming. So you get this moment where you think, I am never going to manage this. Time is too short. You get a couple of days of panic, and then you work through this, and you can, you get a better sense of how to approach this overwhelming archive. So in order to keep the panic level a bit lower, I would advise all of you working on colonial records that you work with your advisors beforehand, and also with other people who have already gone, so that you have some kind of idea of what type of colonial record you're going to look at. As Kasia said, the beauty of being in the archive is, of course, that you find all these other things that you weren't on your horizon, and that's exactly how it should be. Another thing that came up in Kasanya's remark just now is that you have to give yourself time to digest what you collected in the archive. And I know from my own experience, that's something I still do. I still make this mistake, especially now that you're allowed to photograph so many things. You go to the archive, you are in archival bliss, you photograph wildly, and you come back with this huge, huge treasure trove. And you don't really take the time to then go through it, more closely and sift it, by thinking, this is something I can really use, or this is something that, I can use later, but that's not relevant. So again, spacing out the times when you go to the archive is something that maybe you should do right from the get-go. Just plan, exploratory trip early on, make it a little bit shorter, and then a longer targeted trip, or maybe even 2 targeted trips later on in your program.
And I'll just add something to that. Yeah, I think it's so to Alyssa's question, I think it's a good idea to talk to your advisor, people in your department, think what are the funding sources? So for instance, in the English department, once you defend your prospectus, you're basically guaranteed, this installment of research funding. So, but it's not before then. So, if you're kind of planning, it makes sense. Okay, earlier when I don't have access to research funds, this makes sense And then later, I know that I'm likely to be able to access, these research funds that are tied to that. So I think the thinking about the trips, it's like sort of one might be exploratory, and a second one might be very focused. And then, you can also go and talk to they have a fellowships office at UChicago Grad, where their job is to help people, access fellowships and think about that. So I think there's a lot of resources for connecting graduate students to fellowships. So I think one of the nice things about the Nicholson Center Fellowship is that it's not tied to a particular year in the program or some kind of benchmark. If you can sort of articulate a compelling, research need to go, then that, is going to be something that's considered and
so I work on Arabic and a bit of Persian manuscripts, and I'm wondering, because of the focus on British colonial past, is the point of this for us to be able to do research in British archives rather than talk about Britain's relation to the world?
Yeah. Okay. So the terms of the Nicholson Endowment mean that we can only fund travel for student travel to Britain and Ireland to work in libraries and collections there. It will fund any work that happens to be, so if your archive is in the Bodleian, for instance, that then you're very welcome to apply. That when we consider applications, we may think that we prefer to fund students that are working in something that's related to British studies, but that's not necessarily the case. And we've funded lots of students who are working and their resources just happen to be in the UK. So yeah.
I think it's great if you can draw a connection to British studies, but it could be.
Just the collection being there tells us something.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to this. So if you're, like in your case, you're working on a particular manuscript or a body of manuscripts, you may consider, applying for an archival grant in a digitization grant. I'm a book historian myself, so I do understand that for many of you who are working on archives like Kasia, some of you have to see the manuscript, you have to engage with the materiality of the object and have to, work with the physical properties of the manuscript. But for others, you may just want to be interested in the content. So in this case, you may want to apply for a digitization grant. And then, once you have the digitized, manuscript in front of you, you can still say, no, I really, really have to see this manuscript in person and see, what the paper is like, what the, to study the paleography more closely, to study other aspects of the materiality and so on.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's helpful. So I should say that we have two kinds of grants. So the one that's been in existence for longer is the travel grant that these guys have had. But during the pandemic, we invented another kind of research grant, which is really about getting digitized versions of material from when people weren't able to travel. But we've realized that actually there's a real use to that now. Digitization is possible. So it's at the moment we're carrying on with having what we're calling archival research grants, which are usually people have used those to digitize material in collections. And this year we will definitely be offering archival research grants as well. Yeah, I'm sorry, you've had your hand up for a while.
So in all this talk about like an exploratory versus a targeted trip, yeah. I'm wondering, does that mean that it's possible to get the fellowship more than 1 year? Like, could you do an exploratory, apply to the next year for a targeted? Or is it like a one shot, like you can only take one time?
So usually I think students receive one fellowship from Nicholson, but we don't have a rule that disallows you for applying for a second one, and we take second applications for very seriously, and we look at them on the same terms that we looked at the other ones. So you're very welcome to apply twice, but as Julie's saying, that it's quite likely that there will be other resources. So think strategically about spreading your bases around. Yeah, I mean, and that's really good advice for life in general, I think, or life as an academic anyway. So to get into the habit of kind of diversifying the sources that you can call on is actually is a real strength.
Yeah, and I'll just add one point to that. I think if I had another piece of advice to add to the already very good advice that people have had about the applications, I would say, show your legwork. So, for instance, if you've applied to 4 other things and they all haven't worked out, or there's some way that your project has slipped through the cracks, and, then articulate that, and that is compelling rather than just, well, this is the thing I know and I'm applying again. That's less compelling to thinking about what to do with sort of like a limited amount of funds. The same thing with like exhausting kind of like digital resources, or published editions, saying, well, I've already looked at this, or I'm very familiar with the existing editions of this text, but in fact the marginalia aren't included, and so being specific about the fact that you've really pursued the available options, whether that's funding or other ways to access the information that you're looking for. And then, in the event that you're applying for that more focused research trip, the second trip, or that we're imagining, or what have you, then also articulating that research that you've done before that has laid the groundwork. So I'm well prepared to go to this because I've been there before and I'm familiar with this and that. So I think kind of trying to articulate and show that legwork is very persuasive.
Come on. Okay, so maybe this is a moment to think about the application process, and so I'll just show you on the website that all the information is in these drop-down menus about the things that eligibility, the application requirements. So these are the things that you will need to provide in your application. A 3-page project proposal, a 2-page discussion of materials of data to be examined, a budget, a CV, a letter of recommendation from your faculty advisor, confirmation. This is just a small thing from your DGS that says you're in good standing. And then we also ask you to list other grants that you're applying for. So those are the things that you need. And then now, as I say, we have an online process that you can, so that's not terribly interesting, but you can look at that yourselves. And then, as we haven't used it yet, we hope it works. We've tried it out. I've tried applying myself. But I'm going to invite Julie and Uli to say what they think makes a good application.
Mm-hmm. Well, so one point, and this just became very clear in what Hope and Kasia and Kazania did. You have to, when you apply, you have to pitch your project to an audience of faculty members who come from different disciplines. So do this extra work and write the application as an application where you are addressing a body of people who will do the selections, who come from British history, English literature, political sciences, South Asian languages and civilizations, and other fields, which means that at least in the introductory paragraphs of the application, so don't go into into the specifics. Don't write as if you're writing for your PhD committee. Do this work and introduce your project, introduce the main research questions. What's at stake? What's the relevance of what you're doing? What are the questions that you are trying to answer? And then, so once you got this out of the way, then go into the specifics of what you're doing for, you know, for a more in-group audience. So it's important that you give us as a body a sense of, you know, where this project fits in the wider intellectual discourse. What are you really trying? Where's the, you know, which conversation are you joining? Where is your particular take? What's the main research question? And it's really good to, you know, we have seen applications where, you know, we people who are not in the field have to read through 2 pages of an application, and finally at the end you get a sense of, you know, what this project is really doing in the larger picture of things. So be mindful of that. One more thing I wanted to add about making a good application, also be mindful of being in touch with your advisor or whoever writes the letter of recommendation for you. We have seen application where there's a discrepancy between the project proposal and what the recommendation letter says. So that's not good. And you can easily avoid this in, you know, in being in touch with your recommendation writer, with your advisor. The other thing is also, since Ksenia mentioned being specific about the materials you want to look at. So for those of you who are going on this first exploratory trip, sometimes you can't be specific. So you have to find a balance between, you know, identifying, if you, for example, if you work on the colonial record, you have to identify the kind of records you're looking at. For example, you're going to look at the board's collections. You're going to look at the proceedings of the educational department or the home department from this to that year. And I think that's the level of specificity that we would like to see. Of course, you can't at this point, you know, point out this year and this particular document. You don't need to do that, but have a sense of the, you know, of the particular type of record you want to look at. And again, in order to do this, have these preliminary conversations with your advisors. And with other, you know, with your peers who have gone to the archives, who may be working on similar topics, and will tell you, no, you really don't have to look at the newspaper reports because you're not going to find anything for your project. So again, as Julie said, early legwork helps to make the application more focused.
Julie, do you have a...
Yeah, so I think we've covered some of the things. So I think Elia's suggestion is great, that you both want to have that broad moment at the beginning where you articulate kind of, you know, why does this matter within the humanities, social sciences, or within British studies, just kind of having that moment so that people can find their way in. And then making sure you also have the specifics where it's clear you've done your legwork and you've thought about this, you know, again, talking to your advisor, just so the letter matches the application, as well as to kind of get that guidance. I think, you know, try to fit the opportunity into your intellectual biography. So again, just make it clear, is this kind of exploratory? Is it also about like generating skills that, you know, paleography or sort of using these archival resources? Or is it very focused? So for instance, building a database and, you know, and this is going to be what my dissertation is about. And, you know, this is imperative to doing it. So allow us to allow the committee to kind of see that. Then, yeah, I think definitely talking to people. If you hopefully have time sharing your application, you know, with other students or with, you know, a faculty member or something like that, just to get some feedback. That's just a great way to also sort of gain insights from them, and also to kind of hear what may not be making sense, what can you finesse. So yeah, I think
that's great. Yeah, I have to say that reading the Nicholson applications is it's really enjoyable, actually, isn't it? It's really fantastic. You get a sense of all these wonderful projects that are going on. And I think the 3-page project proposal is good because you get enough to get a real kind of flavour of the research that people are doing, and not too much. So, which is always also an advantage. But I was going to say my top tip for writing the application probably be to make it as detailed as you possibly can in terms of the archives and libraries that you want to see. Clearly you don't, the reason you're going is because you want to see what's in these archives. You don't actually know, but you can draw on reference works of reference. There are online resources in each collection that will tell you that you can look at the catalogue and find out what things that you can be looking at. You can be very detailed about this, and many of the applications are extremely detailed, that they go through and they tell you which boxes they're going to call up in the archive that they're going to, and that all is really great. You might think that's a little overwhelming, but that's actually where your advisor can really help, because it's very likely that they've been to that archive too, and they'll know that that's, I mean, they won't know in detail what's in every box, but it's possible that they do, but it's more likely that they'll say, I think that would be a good resource for you to look at. And the other great resource that I've found as I've through my life as I've been working in libraries and collections, librarians and archivists who are really keen to help people coming into archives, and they are really keen to help people coming in for, well, at all stages actually in their careers, but especially at the beginning, because they want people to come and work on the material in the collection. So never be abashed about asking for help and advice from the person that is actually the curator of the collection that you want to work in, because they will really give you they know their collections and they can really, really help you. And I'm sure we've all had this experience of having entire projects kind of made for one by a conversation with an archivist. So yeah, so that's a good, that's my tip. But
yeah, I just wanted to say also, like, Nicholson will not hunt you down afterwards and like ask you to confirm that you looked at every single thing you said you were going to. So, I mean, I guess my understanding of it is that you want to show that you can create a good plan and that you have an idea of what you want to do, but it's totally fine if that changes when you're actually there. I applied to work with way more stuff than I actually could have ever achieved. And then when I got there and I was like corresponding with the archivist at UCL, and he was like, oh, well, this box that you've listed is actually 12 boxes of like personal correspondence with this guy. And I was like, okay, like I guess we don't want that actually. Or we do, but not on a 4-week trip. Yeah, and then another piece of advice I was given.
Can I just say that we don't ask for a checklist, so say that we've seen absolutely everything, but we do ask you to account for yourself at the end. So we ask for a report at the end of the experience, which I think is only a normal kind of process, really, and one that you will need to be in the habit of doing, because when you go have fellowships, you usually have to write a report on the work that you've managed to do during that time. But sorry,
I also was just going to say, for the budget, I also was told to make my budget like realistic. So don't assume that you're going to be able to survive in London on like $50 a week, and also don't like assume that you're going to be like staying in a nice hotel the whole time you're there, but just like look up things that you might actually stay in and include them in your budget, which is also a very helpful like planning your trip tool, because then I just like went through what I had submitted and like booked those places, and it makes you also think about how much money you'll be spending. So like I didn't think to include like my like SIM card cost until I was putting that together, or like money for the tube or whatever. So
yeah, just to speak more to good advice that I got. I think that grant writing is like an incredibly opaque genre and a really important one to kind of learn about. And the thing that I kept running into is, or I think my main issue as I was working through drafts was I'm kind of used to like having a lot of space and pages and paragraphs to like slowly guide my reader through my speculative argument. And this is like definitely not that at all. The best advice I got was to just be very direct and very specific and very concise. And so even with like, if part of your trip is exploratory, like being direct about that was really good advice that I got, like saying, so I had my very specific project that I outlined, and I kind of treated the first paragraph of the application as if it was the only paragraph that was going to get read. And so in just like 3 sentences, I tried to be very direct as like, I need funding to go to X place to look at X, to like look in, like my thesis was very kind of clearly outlined in the first paragraph, which was not like a super long paragraph. And that helped, like I could explore more in the rest of them, but I was still trying to be extremely specific. And I was also specific about the fact that there's a lot that I won't know until I'm on the ground, and talking to archivists and librarians, and being explicit about the fact that I'm going to look at more items, and I can't quite know what they are until I have like the reference books in hand. But then also I also was direct about the fact that also I've given you this like 2-page list of things I want to look at. I know that's not humanly possible within 4 weeks. And so here's how I'm going to divide up my time. And here's what I'm prioritizing looking at. So that, yeah, just like reminding myself continually to be direct and specific, and that this isn't a kind of like seminar paper where I'm trying to prove a kind of abstract argument or make like a very specific point. But the specific point I am trying to make is that I need this much funding to go to this place to look at this, and here's why.
I'll just go off of that. So the way and it's kind of like for all grants, when I think about what I'm doing, I kind of present the very specific things that I'm like, I will not leave the archives until I see these things. And then I also have a list of like, this will be cool. So I do both targeted and exploratory, and I make that clear in the application. So for example, like I'm working on treaties and agreements, and there is the collection of treaties and agreements, but then there's also very annoyingly listed as just miscellaneous correspondence in the colonial office, all the letters that have to do with the signing of the agreement. And while I don't need that like as directly for the data set, it's going to help me understand why I'm putting certain agreements into the data set. And so I had kind of like this whole swath of stuff that I wrote, if I have time to get to, this is supporting materials that I want to look at. And that it was a little more vague, more towards the exploratory stuff. So like I really applied for both targeted and exploratory at the same time.
Yeah, if I can just come in here, I think that's a very good idea. So the specificity has to be there in terms of the materials that you want to look at, but it should also, the materials you want to look at, they should be vaguely commensurate with the time you are spending in the archive. So it doesn't make sense if you're going for 3 weeks and you give us a 3-page list of documents where, you know, where we know you want to go to 4 different archives in 3 weeks and look at this and this and this. Again, you know, in order to find this balance between being specific, but also leaving space to look at other things, you know, if I have time, I'll also look at these things. Conversations with your advisors help. One thing that you have to keep in mind, and again, I'm addressing the people who are working on an empire history of the British Empire or colonialism, not all the records are printed records. So before you go, you should get a sense, if you're looking at the board's collections, for example, of the East India Company, up to, I think, 1830s, they are handwritten documents. They are incredibly difficult to read, some of them, because the ink is faded and the handwriting and all sorts of problems. So these records, if you have to work with them, take a much, much longer time than, you know, printed records where you can just, you know, basically photograph them. So, and in order to know what is printed, what is handwritten, what is in manuscript form, it helps to have conversations with the advisors.
I do have one other note, just look up opening times to also realistically, because certain, like, I'm pretty sure it's Q is closed on Mondays or something. And so I designated like Mondays are for the British Library because they're actually open. And so just kind of being aware of how you might piece together
Public holidays.
Yes. And like being aware of that, because that really impacted what I realized was feasible.
When I went on my trip, it was still a very COVID era, and the British Library was open from like 10 a.m. No, I think it was 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. It's like, whoa, great. That's not what I had in my mind of like a day. And then same with UCL, they ended up, I was able to go for 2 days, and I was able to go for 3 hours each time. And then one of their like employees like had somebody pick up her child from daycare so I could stay for a little longer. But yeah, so opening times really, really important.
Yeah, I didn't go to I just did not go to the archives every day. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that. I didn't go to that. Like, I did not go every day on purpose because I've gone before, and I just know that like if you are going for such a long trip and you are trying to go every single day, it's just mind-numbing sometimes. And I like really needed to like have days in between archive trips to organize all the photos that I took. Like I highly recommend like maybe even as soon as you're done with the archives, just taking an hour to like put them in the right like folder. It helps so much so that you're not like scrambling and panicking like a month later. So like having those days in between, both to do that and to kind of do more research, do more reading, do some writing, was really helpful. So like personally, it depends on how long your trip is and why you're doing it. But I feel like as a general rule, I don't necessarily recommend going to the archives every single day. And I don't think it's like a requisite of getting this kind of grant, especially if you're going for like more than a month.
And especially if you're in London.
Yeah,
so plenty of other things to do.
I mean, I also I wrapped up my whole trip with a conference as well. So I mean, I was able to like go to a conference for a bit and then come back to the archives. And I was actually in the archives with a lot of people I met at the conference. And so thinking about like consolidating those kinds of things might also be a really helpful way to get the most out of your travels.
Yeah, and I think like that's a good way to combine grants. So like for instance, if your department or the division offers like conference funds, so we, the Nicholson doesn't directly fund conferences, but if you're combining it with something else, so in like Kaushal she was able to go to a conference in England, which might be prohibitive, in some cases, but by combining the so it's kind of something you might think of if you're
right. Like I also got funding from the English department for that, for the purposes specifically of that conference, and it overlapped with my archive trip.
Also in general, London has a lot of like opportunities for like professional development and workshops and stuff. Like the IHR is there, and like there's a lot of other things you can do depending on when in the year you go that are going to be really, really helpful to you as an academic, but aren't just like in archive time.
Can I throw out a question to everyone here and ask you about, clearly you're thinking of doing some research in London. So yeah, tell us about what it is that you're thinking of doing, and anything, when you think about your own project, is there anything that comes to mind that you think you really need to know, or something that surprised you, or something that you need to know a bit more about?
Don't be shy.
Yeah.
Ditash, why don't you talk about your project?
So I work on children's literature in the 20th century India, and some of the periodicals that I want to work on have found part of them in the open access digitized study. So I want to sort of explore the rest of those periodicals by going to the British Library.
Yeah, and they're in the British Library.
Yeah.
I think. Yeah.
Some of the other, sorry, I'm a little weak for this, a little slow. And some of the other languages that I plan to look at, although I have not found them in the catalog per se. Okay. But I found references of them in other people's dissertations.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah. That's good. Yeah. Anyone else brave enough to admit to having an inkling for a trip?
If you tell us what you're doing, we can probably have friends who like have access to the library or the archives for that reason and can help you. Like all of my documents are labeled miscellaneous, you know, and that's a pain when you're trying to, I wish I knew someone who is like, well, this miscellaneous is not helpful and this miscellaneous is.
Also what Takash just said about the digitized stuff is like, you want to keep that in mind. Also, every time you pull something, and sometimes something will be super promising, before you go and you read the like 600-page book or whatever, just make sure it's not already digitized, because the university in the past like 3 years, I feel like, has bought all of these Indian office records that like when I went on my trip, we didn't have them, and now we do. And so there's just like, I'm really glad that I kind of learned like what the different sections of the archive were for, and how to like what information I was likely to find and which kind of like dispatch. But now a lot of that is digitized. A lot of colonial office records for the early modern period are like CO1, like super, like I think we have access to the whole thing.
So I mentioned I'm interested in working on Arabic for the manuscript. And so I'm interested in the interface between the two languages, specifically poetry. At this point, or medieval prose in the 11th, 12th centuries, the Seljuk period. So a lot of these, this period in Arabic literature is not very well studied. Maybe, also in Persian literature, not so much. But anyway, so I'm interested in movements, so translations, because it's more common to have Arabic things in Persian text than the other way around. And when I saw that there were many things that were, a few things that were translated from Persian into Arabic, and that people were making use of that because of the rise of Persian as a literary prestige language. I'm interested in that movement, and that's not easy. I want to see how they did it. So the paratextual cues are very important as well, because they both exist on the page in the edited versions as just text, whatever. But I want to see if there are things around that, if the Persian is kind of highlighted in some way, if it's not highlighted, and see how it's kind of dispersed throughout sometimes quite long works, but there are very few things, very few Persian. So anyway, so I'm interested in it. But also spread across different archives. So in Istanbul, particularly in France, the Bibliothèque Nationale will have some. And then also in British, the what they are involved in British.
I can tentatively talk about, I'm a first year PhD, so this is very much a work in progress, but I'm interested in 19th century empire, particularly Britain and Bengal. So the India office records is absolutely crucial. I know that, so I'll be looking at mostly, I think, trade records and conversations around education bills that are being passed, and women's writing that are coming out of periodicals. So some of it is already, I think, available at Heidelberg University's archive. And the reg does have now duplicates of a lot of stuff from British Library. So I've sneakily applied for a job there as a so I can look at the record and sort of make a list of what we already have, and then maybe my second year apply to cover the other things that are not, that we don't have at the British Library then. That's it.
What time period?
19th century. So I'm thinking like 1857, but it might go on to early part of that.
We're just
I don't go any further than 1857. But we'll just switch off.
I have my eye on the time, and I think we need to, unfortunately, when we just started to get interesting, end this session. But thank you all for coming. Thank you very much, especially to our panelists. I hope you found it interesting. I thought it was fascinating. I can see we're going to have a bumper crop of interesting applications for fellowships